Well, thank you very much for that warm introduction, and let me say I'm absolutely delighted to be able to come and spend GIS Day with hopefully a series of, if not fellow geographers, people with interest in spatial questions of one form or another. I should say I'm doubly delighted to be here because in doing just a little background research on the University of Redlands, I saw that the business school was once named after Alfred North Whitehead. And I teach a class at UCLA on economic growth and technology change, really focusing on the spatial dimensions of these issues. And one of the quotes that I enjoy using so much is from Alfred Whitehead. I think it's from his Science in a Modern Economy book from the 1920s, something like that. It's a quote that the students don't really understand, but I'll throw it out anyway because it's such a lovely line. He's talking about the importance of links between the university and industry and the role of science increasingly in propelling economic growth. And he says, the great invention of the 19th century was the invention of the method of invention. So you have to think about it a little bit. But it's basically the idea that we can systemize knowledge production, maybe in R&D labs in universities, things like that. But it's such a lovely quote, so I really am very delighted to be here. And I'd like to talk about some work that has a strong geographic flavor. This is, of course, as we know, GIS Day. And this is some work written with a couple of colleagues, one of whom, Marianne Feldman, who's in the School of Public or Department of Public Policy. She used to be in the Rotman School of Management for a little while in Toronto. So again, there's a management business connection. Dieter Kobler is a geographer working at University College Dublin. I could tell you a little bit about how this strange threesome got together, but I'll save that for later. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the spatial diffusion of rDNA methods. I think I might wander around a little bit, and I'm sure I can speak loud enough in the room that isn't too large. And the idea with this paper was really to try and trace the geographic movement or the spatial movement of a particular piece of knowledge. And the particular piece of knowledge we chose to try and track or trace over time and space was a technology that we associate with the method of recombinant DNA analysis. So rDNA work really came of age in the mid-1970s when a series of chemists and biologists figured out how to splice or separate genetic material and then recombine it in all sorts of different ways, usually linking it with a virus or a bacteria because those types of things replicate very, very quickly, and then you get different genetic material that you can muck around with, I think, for the most part. Things have become much more systematized today. But anyway, you'll see as I go along that actually I'm not interested in DNA at all. I might be a little bit, but I'm just going to use rDNA as an illustration of how we might, again, track the flow of knowledge, or again, as the flow of a piece of knowledge over time and space. So, I have a relatively formal talk, and I actually have a few equations at the end, but I'm going to dispatch with those because I have a few additional slides that are linked to the talk, which I think you'll quite enjoy right at the end. But so the formal part, I do have a couple of research objectives, and one of these I've really already outlined, and that is to say something about the spatial spread or the geographic movement of a particular new technology across cities in the US. So I'll label cities as either cities or metropolitan areas. So I want to look at how knowledge flows between cities. Second thing I want to do is say something about the roles played by what I'm going to call geographic proximity. Now, we all know what geographic proximity is. You're more proximate to someone sitting at the same table as than you are to someone sitting at a different table. Although that's not strictly true, because the provost and dean are pretty close to the guy sat right behind them, actually. So I'm playing a little loose with my geography here. But I want to say something about the way geographic proximity or distance influences knowledge flow. But I also want to say something about how social relationships, social proximity, influence knowledge flow. And I want to talk about one other type of proximity that's a bit trickier as well, and that's something I'll call cognitive proximity. And I'll try and help you understand what I mean by cognitive proximity a little more, a little later on with a couple of slides. So these two aims underpin what I'm trying to do with the rDNA technology. Additional motivation. There's been a long history of work in diffusion, the spatial movement of technology, of ideas, of knowledge within the discipline of geography and economics. And this goes a long way back. Maybe it goes back, perhaps we can trace it back to Torsten Hägerstrand, the famous geographer working in Sweden in the 1950s, who was looking at the adoption of tuberculosis controls in dairy cattle by farmers. So he was really set up as one of the founding fathers of work in spatial diffusion. Thereafter, his work, Hägerstrand's work, was popularized in the US by Alan Pratt from Berkeley, who looked at some forms of knowledge interaction across cities. And we also have work by Larry Brown, who was formerly at Ohio State University, who wrote also a book on innovation diffusion. Now, this work at the top is all relatively old. But over the last couple of decades, people have become a lot more excited again by knowledge of different sorts and how that knowledge is exploited to underpin growth. And the way that I think to understand exactly what's going on here is that we all recognize that the world economy today is becoming increasingly integrated. You know, whatever we buy, whether it's a car, a computer, a notebook, or any other sort of device that we might use, components of that product are likely made in different regions and countries all around the world. So a lot of people have talked about globalization as flattening the world economy, and many of us subscribe to that claim. Geographers tend not to like that claim so much because it discounts geography in fairly significant ways. But we clearly know there's something going on in terms of the integration of economic, social, cultural activity around the world. Now, the question then is, what enables individual regions, parts of the world or global economy, to track growth? Right? Every region wants to track growth. The city of Redlands wants to track growth, and it knows it can do it with two great institutions. One of those would be the University of Redlands. Another one would clearly be Esri. The city would not like to lose either of those two growth engines. But what is it more generally that traps growth in particular places? The important argument about the flattening of the economy is that many commodities can be moved easily from place to place. They're not tied to locations as much today as they previously might have been. Many people have argued that what it is that traps growth is knowledge, but not all knowledge, only knowledge that some people call complex or tacit. That type of knowledge that's not easily communicated and sent to people all around the world. Many people distinguish between what we call codified knowledge, that you can write down in an email, push the button and send it to Hong Kong or Europe or somewhere else. But it's that kind of knowledge, because you can send it so easily, doesn't do anything, again, in terms of trapping growth. But what is critical to the growth process then is the types of knowledge that get stuck in particular places. So we sometimes call it in geography sticky knowledge, stuff that's spatially sticky. This complex knowledge that you can't easily move from place to place. There is an enormous amount of interest in questions about sticky or tacit knowledge today because everyone is chasing growth. Everywhere now increasingly around the world is competing with everywhere else.
So how do we generate competitive advantage? We do it through knowledge production. Universities have figured that out. They figured it out a long time ago, but knowledge production is becoming increasingly key. So there's a lot of people now, in particular Goethe and others, who are very much interested in the academic literature and understanding what it is that makes knowledge sticky, and that comes out of work by Polanyi, again from much earlier, the 1950s. A lot of other people are interested in looking at how knowledge flows. There's some very famous work by some economists, Jaffe, Trachtenberg, and Henderson in the mid-1990s, where they argued that geography plays a very, very strong role in regulating the flow of knowledge. And they said effectively that when people are close together, knowledge flows. When people are far apart, knowledge doesn't flow quite so randomly. Some of the reasons for that are relatively obvious. So for Jaffe then, geography plays a critical role. Some other economists, about 10 years later, Bresci and Lassoni, a couple of Italian guys who play a lot with patent data, came along and said, you know, I'm not so sure that geography is so important to the flow of knowledge. And what they did is say, let's take the same data that Jaffe played with, and instead of just looking at geography, let's have a look at non-geographical social relationships between inventors. And so I should have pointed out that the Jaffe paper is based upon looking at relationships between inventors of patents, so inventors of new pieces of information or knowledge. Bresci and Lassoni take the same data, and what they do is they treat the data first, and they try and tease out from the data what social connections inventors might have had. So, for instance, if you get two inventors in the same firm, then they have a clear social connection. Once you remove all the social connections from the data and re-examine the data in the way that Jaffe did, sure enough, the role of geography was significantly reduced. That's then set up a big debate. Is it social proximity that really regulates knowledge flow? Does knowledge flow easily when people know each other? Or is it geography? It's really both, but I'm just trying to set this up as a fun debate. But it's a super hot area in the research right now. Is it social proximity? Is it geographic proximity that really counts? Well, it turns out there are 3 or 4 more types of proximity that we have to muck around with, and I'll talk about at least one more of these. So I'm trying to give you, at least some of you that perhaps don't work so closely in an academic environment, some background in terms of what it is that makes the academics among us exciting or excitable. And it's strange questions like this. Is it social proximity? Is it spatial? I wish I was going to answer that for you tonight. I'm going to try and sneak my way closer to an answer, but I'm not going to be able to go all the way. All right. So very briefly, standard roadmap of where I'm going to go. I'm going to talk just for 5 minutes or so about rDNA technology. Then I'm going to show some show a little bit of background data that speaks to how this technology has moved across US cities. And then I'm going to talk about how we might measure geographic proximity, social proximity, and cognitive proximity. So I'm going to follow very much a social science type format. I'm going to lay out this theoretical problem, which I've tried to do already a little bit. I'm going to talk about how I might get some data, build some data in order to examine that problem from an empirical or a statistical point of view. And then I was going to talk about results. But I'm probably going to skip through that because no one, certainly when you're eating dinner, wants to talk about regression and a whole bunch of statistical analysis. So I'll flip through the results. I hope we'll have a bit more fun along the way. So a little bit of background on this rDNA. So again, the rDNA method is really all about gene splicing and combining genetic material. That's really all we need to know. So, who developed, or who is generally thought of as developing this technology in the United States? It was 2 scientists, Stanley Cohen at Stanford University and Herbert Boyer at UC San Francisco Medical School. In 1974, they applied to the US Patent and Trademark Office, the USPTO, they applied for a patent for the work that they had done in 1974. The patent was not granted until 1980. Now, I should say a patent, as many of you probably know, is a legal contract that gives the developers of new knowledge the sole rights to commercially benefit from use of that knowledge for a set period of time. So if someone comes along with a great idea, they can run to the patent office, hopefully, and say, hey, this is a new idea that I've developed. I want to do something with it and hopefully make some money, and I want you to officially recognize me as the first developer of that new knowledge, so to not allow any competitors to use that knowledge for a limited period of time. So that's not a very formal definition of what a patent is, but I hope you get the general idea. So Cohen and Boyer applied for patent protection in 74. They don't get it to 1980. What was going on? So very quickly, well, in 1975, Paul Berger, who later won the Nobel Prize for work on rDNA at Stanford, was mucking around in the lab doing all this cutting and splicing of genetic material, and people started freaking out. They were very, very nervous that this genetic material was going to get out of the lab and into society in general. And people were very nervous about this. Why? Because we had no safeguards. Basically, it was the wild, wild west. We didn't know what we were doing in terms of treatment rooms and separating and isolating these bio labs where potential hazards could be produced. So then a whole bunch of people got together on the beach up in Asilomar, further up the coast, and they ironed out a whole series of protocols for the development of these rDNA technologies in clean and secure environments. That was done, they could move ahead, and they did move ahead, but only as far as early 1980, when a fellow called Chakrabarty, who was working for GE, had developed an organism that consumed oil molecules. And so he thought he would patent this organism. It might be useful for helping break up oil spills and stuff like that. So he applied for patent protection, and Diamond, who was head of the USPTO, said, no, you can't patent genetic material. What was the logic? Well, genetic material potentially is a thing of nature. You shouldn't be able to patent things of nature. You should only be able to patent new knowledge that you've generated. Diamond lost. The US Supreme Court ruled you could patent genetic material, certain kinds of genetic material. Then the one last hurdle we had to get across was that UCSF, of course, is a public institution, and universities were not allowed up to 1980 to file patents. Public universities were not allowed to file patents, in large part because it was recognized that public universities are funded with public money. So why should universities be able to appropriate the returns from this publicly funded research? That was overturned by the Bayh-Dole Act in 1980. The patent was granted. Was it an important patent? Oh, yes. Perhaps the most successful in terms of university licensing. Stanford received over $250 million in licensing revenue as a result of this patent, and the patent itself generated $35 billion worth of global product sales. It was huge. Now, I actually don't care about any of this. It was even, I know you can't say huge, but it was even bigger for me in a very different sense. This patent was so revolutionary. The new knowledge that the patent claimed was so unique, the patent office didn't know where to put it. All patents are placed in a number of different categories, just as firms are placed in industries, according to what firms produce. So there are 428 primary patent classes and 150,000 subclasses. They couldn't figure out where they were going to put this patent in this classification system, so they developed a new subclass order. I'm actually going to treat this new subclass as a regular primary class. So I'll say now there's 429 regular classes with the Cohen-Boyer patent or rDNA patent forming one of those. So for me, this was great because here I've got the first patent in a brand new patent class, Now what I'm going to do is look at new patents that get placed in that class and have a look where those new patents originate from. i.e., where were the scientists who were doing the novel work and new discoveries on rDNA, and where were they located in the US? So the rDNA patent's great for me because it provides a mechanism that I can trace related knowledge in this rDNA category over time and space. So I'm no more interested in DNA. I've just got some data that I can play with. But it is a very fun patent. Herb Boyer founded Genentech, maybe one of the biggest biotech companies up in the Bay Area as a result. And truth be told, rDNA underpinned the entire new biotech industry. It really formed the foundations of that industry in the US and elsewhere. Okay, so a little bit of background data. Now I've said a few things about rDNA, and this is very much the guts of the talk. We've got a simple graph here where we've got time from the mid-1970s, and those of you that are thinking about the timing will say, wait a minute, it should start in 1980, but I can come back to that. So this chart goes from 1976, and the timeline runs up through about 2005 when some of my data peter out. The black line shows the number of cities in which inventors are developing new rDNA patents. And you can see that initially, through the late 70s, early 80s, there's very few cities involved, just a handful, 4 or 5, up to 10 or so. But over time, in a very classic way, following what we might think of, or what academics would call a logistic or an elongated S-shaped curve, we see the number of cities that are developing rDNA patents suddenly start increasing. And then it climbs relatively steeply until about the mid-90s when the number of cities and the other line traces the actual number of patents moves quite similarly. When the number of cities producing rDNA technology tends to level out. So the key for me is that I see a growth in the number of cities that house inventors developing new technology in the rDNA class. I want to figure out which cities were being added to this chart at different times. Here's the real question. Was rDNA technology moving out from the Bay Area, where it was initially developed, in a form of what we call contagious or epidemic diffusion? Think of me standing up here, I throw a stone into a pond and I watch the ripples radiate out. That's the classic case of epidemic or contagious diffusion. Information is passed person to person, slowly radiates out. Or do I see new rDNA patents being produced, say, in Boston or Chicago or San Diego or Philadelphia? That's hierarchical diffusion, where we see big jumps over space. So that's one interesting question for geographers. The data don't really truncate on the end. I have what we call, again, in more statistics speak, some right censoring problems. My data simply run out by 2005, and I've now got a few more years I could add on the end of this. But in reality, I think these two lines would maintain pretty much a horizontal state over the end of this time series. All right, so I'm going to give away some of the results now. Which were the most important cities in terms of rDNA production? And the column to focus on, as well as the city name, is the one over on the far right, which shows the year when a city reaches 10 rDNA patents. So the Bay Area gets this first. 1981, we've already got 10 patents. Right? I should probably point out, again, why did my graph the former graph start in 76? What's very cool about the USPTO, the patent office, is when a new class is formed, they then go back all the way to the first patent in 1790 and reclassify. And they did indeed find a couple of patents that they could put in the rDNA class that predated Cohen and Boyle. So that's the 76. So, San Francisco, the Bay Area, gets there first because, not surprisingly, that's where the technology really was developed. But then, it does not initially radiate out, as contagion diffusion would have us believe. It jumped over to Boston, right? A fairly big biotech center. It jumped down to Philly. Why? Huge pharmaceutical industry, strong connections between bio and pharma. Then to Washington. Some people have argued big biotech or fairly sizable biotech there, but very much connected to regulation type activities. Then New York, and then down the coast to San Diego, even closer, San Jose, up the coast to Seattle. So there seems to be considerable evidence here that we see hierarchical diffusion of these two. So right, now I want to try and model this movement. I've even got where I live, 1,000 notes down on the bottom here. It's got to be much later on, 94, that might be Amgen. Still the biggest private biotech company in the United States. Falling apart a little bit this summer, certainly in terms of employment numbers. All right. So we've got some background information on the cities and the movement of this technology. So now I want to develop a model of the spatial movement of rDNA technology. I did have an equation up here. I thought I'd get rid of that. I'm sure you're all very happy about that. So I've got a model. It's a little equation, a statistical model, where on the left-hand side, I might have for every city in every year from 1980, I've got either a 0 or a 1. A 0 meaning that the city has not developed an rDNA pattern, a 1 indicating that the city has. So it's a simple model with a binary variable, 0 or 1 on the left-hand side. And I'm really interested in how geographic proximity, social proximity, and cognitive proximity, how they influence this 0-1 value, or how they influence the spatial movement of rDNA. So, if I'm going to operationalize this model, I can turn to the pattern data and I've got all my 0-1 values, that's easy, but now I have to generate measures of geographic, social, and cognitive proximity. Right, this is a little bit trickier, or one or two of those are. So, I'm going to start with cognitive proximity. So this is, I think, maybe the trickiest one to get your head around. I want to know, in a city, for a city as a whole, how the knowledge base of the city, whatever I mean by the knowledge base of the city, just imagine a city is an aggregation of individuals. All those individuals have knowledge about different things that may be expressed in the form of the output they produce. It might actually not be expressed. But the city has a knowledge core that's a function of the knowledge that's trapped or embodied in the individuals that live in the city. I need to know how close that aggregate knowledge core is to rDNA, to this particular subset of knowledge. The way I'm going to do that, the way I'm going to try and figure that out, is first of all, I need to know how far the rDNA technology, the class into which that technology, that patent is placed, how far away from every other patent class the rDNA patent class is. So I've got 439 classes, groupings into which patent data are placed. I need to figure out the distance between every pair of those groups. Another way of thinking about this would be to say, and this will work for certainly the university administrators and the faculty and the students, I need to figure out a way of measuring the distance between every department on campus. Right? And how might I do that? Well, here, I'll give you one example. What I might do is I'm going to look at all the faculty on the campus at the university, and I'm going to look at all the publications that they've produced. I'm going to take each paper in turn over a given period, and I'm going to see if two faculty members, if two or more faculty members co-write that publication. If they do, I'll identify this paper as being written by two faculty members. Now, then I'll look at what departments those two faculty members are in. And I'm going to repeat that exercise for every publication that's written. And if I have enough publications over enough faculty members spread across enough departments, I'm going to be able to figure out the probability of two faculty members in any pair of departments co-authoring a published piece of work. And I'm going to use that probability as a measure of my distance between the two departments. I could do this a different way. I could use citations. On every patent, there's a legal requirement that there must be citations to previous knowledge. It's how we figure out, in part, the new knowledge that's added on a new patent. So I might use citations. The way to do that, again, is to simply look at all the classes into which a cited and a citing patent are placed, and then again to work out some probabilities that, on average, a patent in one class will cite a patent in a different class. So there's a bunch of methods that you could follow. So I use, in this case, this co-classification, just as I look at individual faculty members in two departments. So I'm going to look at every single patent over a time period. I'm going to look at all the co-inventors on those patents, and I'm going to see in which classes. I'll actually just make something up. Let me just step back a second. I'm going to take each patent, and each patent gets placed in a number of different knowledge classes, depending on the knowledge that's actually the new knowledge that's generated in that patent. So I'm then going to look at all the different pairs of knowledge classes into which patents are placed to figure out distances between these knowledge classes. Then, once I've got that, I can take some patent data for cities and calculate how far away from the rDNA technology each city actually is. And I'll operationalize that in another way in a second, but let me reinforce what I'm doing with a diagram. Hopefully this will make it easier because I screwed up part of that presentation. Each node on this graph represents one of these different technology classes. Now, if my methodology makes sense, if I group these individual patent classes into more aggregate groupings, I should see, at least among some of them, some clustering. Let me take an example. The black points represent individual knowledge classes in chemicals-related technological areas. Now, I assume that there's a common base of knowledge that's shared by a lot of new patents within the chemicals area. And so, the distances between all the black nodes should be relatively small, capturing the fact that there's a shared knowledge base to all patent classes within the chemical sector. And sure enough, the black nodes do tend to cluster in this two-dimensional visualization of all these relationships. Similarly, red is electronics or electrical-related patents. They tend to cluster in this area of the knowledge space. The green, in 1980, there's not much of it. It's computers and communication. But the green nodes also cluster down in this area of the knowledge space. Right, so that clustering gives me some confidence that what I'm doing makes sense. Colomboya is located way down here in the bottom left-hand corner in 1980. It's fairly near to some other drug and medical classes, and it's also fairly near to chemicals in general, for some of the reasons I talked about earlier. So, I have to point out again that I measure then the distance between every pair of these nodes. So 438 times 437, that's the number of pairs I've got. And so I have a big matrix with lots of numbers, and then it's a big multi-dimensional scaling. I collapse 437 dimensions down to 2 to represent it in this visualization. So some fun and expected things happen over time. 1995, drug and pharma explodes. I should have said the size of each of those little circles, the nodes, the size of each of these technology classes is a function of the number of patents found in each one. What do we see from 1980 to 1990? A massive explosion in drugs and medical knowledge production. So these are all scaled, so you can compare one year to the next. Look at the sizes of the drugs and pharma group. It's exploded massively, as has computing, electronics, the red dots, and computing, if you like, ICT, into the green dots. Cone-Boyer has shifted right quite a bit. It's now more firmly established within other drugs and medical technologies. Shifted a little bit away from patents. And I'll just show one more. 2005, drugs and medical have declined a little bit. Electronics has gotten significantly bigger. Computing, information technologies, even bigger still. We see even more evidence now of clustering within this knowledge space. People are using this knowledge space stuff to do all sorts of weird and wonderful things, like looking at the technology distance between a pair of cities, things like that. And I'll show you a slide later on. Cone-Boyer, again down in the bottom, actually fairly close to some electronics technologies now. I'm not sure what might be driving that. So, what do? I take an individual city, and I take all the patents in the city, and I can locate those patents in any one of these nodes, and I then take, for every patent, I calculate the distance from that node to Cone-Boyer. And I do that for every single patent in a city, and then I just average it. So it's a pretty crummy measure, but it's not bad, maybe. So for every city, I've got a distance of the knowledge base of the city in terms of all the patents that have produced that. So another way of thinking about this is, if I have a city that only does biotech, it's going to have loads of patents in this area here, very close to Cone-Boyer. So cognitive proximity, there's a lot of knowledge in that city that's close to rDNA. So in terms of cognitive proximity, it's fairly easy for that city to move into the Cone-Boyer class. If the city, on the other hand, is producing the blue, the mechanical patents, well, they're located over here for the most part, a long way away from Cone-Boyer. If I've got a city, I'll say Detroit. I'll pick on Detroit. That doesn't do much pharma, much chemicals, that doesn't do, in particular, drugs and medicine. It's going to have a tough time, all of a sudden, developing rDNA technology. It doesn't have the right knowledge base. People there are very smart, but they're smart in other parts of knowledge base. They're not smart in rDNA. They will have a difficult time developing rDNA patents. They don't have the right skill set. So this is what I mean by cognitive proximity. Cities that have got a lot of patents near Cone-Boyer are going to be able to develop that technology a lot easier than cities that don't have similar expertise. That's my cognitive proximity. Social proximity, this one's a bit more mathy, I hate to say. What I'm going to do to measure social proximity is to look at all the inventors on all the Cone-Boyer patents in a given period. So I'll take the data for 1 year, and I'll look at all the rDNA or Cone-Boyer patents, and I'll look at all the inventors who are located across the US. I'll look at all the co-inventor relationships. What I mean by that is that if these two ladies here have developed a Cone-Boyer patent, if they're rDNA inventors, then I'll find them on a patent, I have their names, and I also know what cities they're working from when they develop this new technology. So I'm going to exploit that information, and I'm going to do it in the following way. First of all, I'm going to build a matrix. So a matrix is just like an Excel spreadsheet or something. It's a page with lots of columns and lots of rows. Or it's a table with lots of columns and lots of rows. And I'm going to populate that matrix with 0 values. Right? So all the cells in the matrix are 0, hold a 0. And I should have said that all the rows correspond to my list of cities in the US, and so do all the columns. So I've got 366 cities into which I can place inventors. Now, what I do is, for a given year, I look at all the rDNA patents, and then if I find an rDNA patent where there have been 2 inventors, let's say, if those inventors are located in the same city, then I'll take the number 1 and I'll put a 1 somewhere in what we call the principal diagonal of that matrix. It's the diagonal that runs from top left to bottom right. So it's the cells that have a number 1, 1, row 1, column 1, row 10, column 10, row 100, column 100. However, it gets interesting when I find a patent with, say, 2 or more inventors that come from different cities. Say I have a patent with inventors who come from city 1 and city 5. Then I put a 1 in row 1 of the matrix, column 5, and I make the matrix symmetric. So I also put a row in, number 1 in row 5, column 1. That says that city 1 and 5 have a social connection through the pair of inventors. I replicate this process for many thousands of patents, only looking at co-inventors on co-Boyer patents. Right, so I do all that, and now my matrix, which formerly only had zeros, has got quite a few 1s, 2s, 3s, and higher numbers in it. The bigger the number, the greater the social connection, the greater the social proximity between a pair of cities. So if I find a city that has very high social proximity with, say, San Francisco, I know the biotech rDNA has been generated, developed in San Francisco. If I find another city with very strong social connections through rDNA patenting to San Francisco, it's likely that that sister city will develop an rDNA technique because there's a pipeline between the co-inventors. That's what I'm trying to measure with this social proximity argument. Now I do one more thing, which is a bit trickier. I also say, so far I've only looked at co-inventors on rDNA patents. But a lot of those same inventors generate patents that have nothing to do with rDNA. And sometimes they work with other co-inventors on those other patents. And just maybe as they're sitting around having dinner or a beer, they exchange some information about other things they're working on. So I also look at every co-inventor on an rDNA patent, and Ed, who works with other co-inventors on non-rDNA patents. But I have to discount that second set of relationships. And I don't do this in a very fancy way. I don't even check whether I've done this a really good way. I just say, rather than add a 1 to a cell in the matrix, I'm going to add a 0.5. I have no idea if that makes sense. I just know it should be a number greater than 0 and less than 1. And I don't do any sensitivity analysis or anything like that. So I've now got a matrix. In fact, I got one of these matrices for every one of my 35 or so years, measuring the strength of social connections between cities. And again, I'm going to exploit that in the following way. I take that matrix, I then feed it into some specialized software that helps me calculate a series of measures of the centrality of each city. And I can link that, so I get a measure of how well connected a city is to all other cities. And I can also measure the strength of that connection conditional upon the origin cities already having information about rDNA. So I can do all sorts of fancy things with this social proximity matrix. Finally, I have to measure geographic proximity. That's a simple one for us because I'm just measuring geography. But I'm going to do this in 3 ways. First of all, I'm going to do it in a way that's not all that appealing to me. I'm just going to take the latitude and longitude, the coordinates for each city, and measure the Euclidean distance between them. I could use a great arc distance or something else, but I don't think it matters. Once I heard that some of the founding fathers in spatial analysis used to take the corner of a page and a ruler and measure the distance between cities that way. And an awful lot of the early spatial analysis, certainly for US cities, was based on this one page. And I kid you not. It worked fine. It's just a different coordinate system, right? The corner of the page versus, somewhere in England or something like that. So geographic proximity by 1 is just coordinates, calculate Euclidean distances between cities. Don't forget what I'm interested in looking at here, again, is that question. If this table here is a city that's developed rDNA, if you're a table that's close, you might easily get knowledge of rDNA. Much earlier, perhaps, than a table or a city that's far away. That's what I'm trying to get at here. But it's complicated because I know there's a social connection between geographers, sorry, not geographers, but people in management on this table and people on management on this table. That's the social proximity between these two cities. So if rDNA has been developed here, even though this city is a good distance away from this city, there's a social connection between, I'll call you guys co-inventors in the management school, the business school, then that might overcome the geographic separation, or even some cognitive separation. So, why I don't like the Euclidean distance measure is that I've got data that changes every year, year after year. I've got more and more cities, or a different set of cities developing rDNA. Unfortunately, geography doesn't change. Not the Euclidean, not the simple Euclidean geography. So, I don't like that. It's a static measure. Some of my models, I can't even use it. So I've got a byte 2. What I do in byte 2 is I take my 300, I've got another matrix with these distances between all pairs of cities. That's my Euclidean distance matrix. I then multiply that with a vector, which tells me whether or not a city in a year has developed an rDNA pattern. So I've got a vector, just a column of numbers, 366 numbers, one for each city, which is either a 0, the city has not developed rDNA, or a 1, the city has developed rDNA. So I find the product of this, I know it's too much math, the product of this matrix and vector, that gives me a measure overall of, on average, how far away is a city from all other cities that have developed rDNA. That's a better measure because that one changes over time, because I find the product of my fixed Euclidean space matrix and this vector of zeros and ones that changes every year. As new cities develop rDNA, the zeros disappear and ones appear. As some cities stop making rDNA, the ones turn back to zeros. So anyway, it's just the geography that changes over time. But I don't use that one. Why? Because who cares about the average distance? What I want is the minimum distance to a city, from one city to another city that's developed rDNA. So I can actually find that from this same product matrix. So I try Euclidean distance, and then I take this minimum distance measure to Cohen-Boyer. This minimum distance from all cities to their nearest neighbor that has already developed this technology. That's the critical variable. It's that minimum distance that should be key.
So now I've got some regressions, which nobody really wants to look at. Well, one person wants to look at. Let me just, I've got three of these, and I really don't want to talk about them, but let me just say a couple of things. This is a hazard model, so it doesn't have what you would consider regular regression coefficient. What's a hazard model? Developed typically in the medicine area, and someone's sick. You want to know how long they're going to last for. You give them some medicine. You count the number of days till they either get better or they die. Okay. It's binary, right? 0 or 1. I know I could measure that outcome in a different way. That's an easy way. This model has a series of very nice properties. One of the things I talked about earlier, I've got that problem of right censoring. My data runs out on the right-hand side. That's a huge problem. It's dealt with in the following way. It's a technical argument. I'm not going to go there. The hazard model helps me with this right censoring issue. For the statisticians, fixed effects models, no variation in the dependent variable, the observation gets thrown out. I don't want that. It has information. So, what do you read from this table? First of all, I have positive number on social proximity, on cognitive proximity, and lots of little stars. That's statistics speak for this variable is important. Right? So social proximity is important, cognitive proximity is important in regulating flow. So is geographic proximity, and proximity is kind of weird with this. This is my minimum distance variable, so as that minimum distance increases, I should expect the probability of rDNA development decreasing, and it does. It goes less than 1. These are probabilities, or can be read as that.
But up here, I've got my old Euclidean distance measure, which gives me a totally different result. This one is saying as distance increases, there is a greater likelihood that a city will develop rDNA technology. I can't easily put those two things together in this model, but if I bounce ahead and separate some time periods, this is, I think, I'll leave it after this one, this is what's going on. Early in the period, pre-1995, we've got the hierarchical movement going on. rDNA is developed in the Bay Area, and the next cities that develop this technology are a long way from the Bay Area. So I get positive on my average distance to other cities, and my minimum distance one is insignificant. That's absolutely as I would expect. Get past 1995, now the pattern of diffusion, spatial diffusion for this technology switches. It doesn't jump big distances anymore. In fact, it can't, because it's already moved to all the edges, if you like. Now follows a process of spatial infilling, which is much more like the academic model. And where does it go after the big cities? Pretty much goes to all the university towns across the country. Why? Because they've probably got the biotech, cognitive, and other expertise that you need. It's a very nice story, I think. Some weird stuff going on as well. Spending on university R&D. In this model, it's insignificant, and it has the wrong sign in the next page of results that I'm going to not show you. University spending is negative in terms of the diffusion of rDNA. It doesn't make any sense. Industry R&D is positive. That has the right sign. We don't have any R&D data for cities in the US. What have I done? I took every NIH award for every year of this period and distributed those. And then was told later on that NIH probably wasn't the best set of R&D measures to use. I've just built out NSF data in a similar way. I should probably try that. But the effective story is, I'm going to pass this one. From the models, we do find that geographic, social, and cognitive proximity are all working very clearly in ways that we would anticipate. It's not easy for me in this model to pull out whether the effect of whether social is greater than the spatial or vice versa. I could have a go at that question, but it's not one that I really want to try and tackle using these data. City size, as I say, industry R&D work in the way we anticipate, but the university R&D really doesn't make much sense at all. So that's the sort of take-home story. I went very quickly in the results because I want to show you just 3 or 4 more slides which have nothing to do with R&D. But they talk a lot about how different people are using the patent data, again, to do some different things, and this, hopefully some nice visuals. The dots here are another representation of the knowledge space, where the colors represent, again, different aggregate types of technology. And again, you see the sort of same pattern with some clustering of technologies as we expect. But what we've done in this space is we've located cities. So we've put cities into our knowledge space. Now, this knowledge space is actually very complicated. It's based on what's called a maximum tree spanning algorithm. That locates in the center of the space knowledge types that are critical in terms of knowledge production at the time for a given year that we're looking at. But it also locates the most important cities in terms of knowledge production in the center of this space. And what do we see? New York is here pretty much in the middle. It's just so huge. It does everything. It's in the middle of the space. San Jose is a very big player, also moving in this space. San Francisco, also close to the middle of the space. Boston, all big cities, Chicago. Then we get a couple of interesting outliers. I've forgotten. Austin. And I'll come back to Austin in a couple of minutes. Houston is over there. But the real fun one is Detroit. When we generate this space in the mid-1970s, which is the earliest period we can generate it for, Detroit, LA is a bit out from the center, I should have pointed out. Detroit is up much closer to LA. And so are most of the other Rust Belt or Snow Belt cities in the US. But there, and some of them still, Detroit, Dayton, still pattern quite a lot. but they patent in technologies that are not so cutting edge anymore. And what happens then in a spanning tree algorithm is those cities then drift over time away from the core. The core is where the real cutting edge stuff is going on. So this is really cool. So we see these old snowbelt cities becoming, I don't want to say increasingly obsolete, but they are from a sort of industrial point of view, and certainly from a knowledge production point of view. So this is really nice. I'm trying to push ahead with some more work on mapping cities in knowledge space. I also have the European data to do the same thing. And here's another fun graph. What I've just finished doing is we take all patents and we have a way of measuring how complex the knowledge is in every patent class. From simple knowledge, which has a value close to 0, and complex knowledge that has a value close to 1. This is kind of like, I hope, capturing a little bit of that codified to tacit dimension. Then I can take all the patents produced in different parts of the country over time and look at those places, those cities that are producing the most complex knowledge. It's not entirely clear if this is the most valuable knowledge, but there is a reasonable correlation between patent citations and these knowledge classes. And what do we see? San Jose comes out at the top of the list. Maybe not that surprisingly, it's got a lot of cutting-edge technology production going on. Where else might not surprise us that much? Up around the Seattle area. And now my geography lets me down. Portland, I think, is that Eugene or Corvallis? Corvallis, sorry. Eugene. It's one of the two. Might be university, but there's a big Intel plant also up near one of the two universities. That's having a big effect. The one that's probably got you all completely flummoxed is Boise, right? It's huge. And I can tell you in 1975, this is 2005, I think. 1975, Boise had 19 patents. Only 2 in one class, and that class was weighing scales. There was nothing going on in terms of knowledge production in Boise. Right? What happened? Boise comes from nowhere to be one of the top knowledge production cities in the US. Probably is the number one in terms of knowledge production per capita. Well, the guy that developed the laser printer for HP came into work one day and says, I'm going to Boise. You can let me take the printer division with me or not. Your call. They said, okay, here's the printer division. Away you go. And it turned out there were a couple of big semiconductor firms already up there. And now, it's the HP with these semiconductor firms. It's a hotbed of semiconductor, discrete device manufacturing, lots of knowledge production. It's really quite astounding. Austin we've already seen, Dell, and a bunch of other stuff. The little brown up there at the bottom of Minnesota, that's Rochester, Minnesota. That's IBM. And it's also, there's a big cancer clinic up there. It's connected to, it's part of Mayo, right? Yeah. And where else? Okay, so we've got IBM there. If you look down at lower New York, we've also got Poughkeepsie, IBM's headquarters. Upstate New York, we've got Rochester, New York. That's the optics capital of the United States. There's one really odd one that you can hardly see, and I can't explain it, and I think it might be a data error. And that, I think, is Ocean City, New Jersey. Shouldn't be there, I'm sure about that. Anyway, California in general looking pretty good, as you might expect in terms of this graphic. All right, I've just got 2 more. So, I've got nodes again. The nodes now are not patent classes, they're regions, and they're European city regions. And again, I take patent data in Europe, and I build a map of where those regions are located. Right? And I'll just say for the moment that the grey regions are individual regions in the UK. Right? And so what I do again is I take all the patents and I look at all the inventors on the patents, and I know what city, if I have again 2 co-inventors on the same patent, I flag the regions, the city regions where those co-inventors are located. I do that across a series of patents, and I can construct a measure of the distance based on collaborations between all European regions. So if you look at this, the grey is the UK. Why? Because it's always grey there. Black is Germany. The red is Austria, that's almost underneath Germany. Blue is France. Orange is the World Cup colours, I guess, for the Netherlands. The light green is Italy and the dark green is Spain. I've only got the EU 15 on here. I apologize. I can't remember the other colours. Right, this is the late 1970s. Now, I oriented this so that the UK was in the top left, which it is sort of in Europe. Right? There's no geography in this graphic. There's no geography whatsoever. It's just based on collaborations. But what it's showing is that there is a geography behind the collaborations. You're much more likely to collaborate with someone in a nearby region. The interesting thing is there's language affinities. As I say, German regions are right on top of Austrian regions. There's a language group there, close connections. So the regions in both those two countries fall on top of one another. We've got something that looks like geography at the bottom. What happens if we come up to 2005? There's a lot of integration, of course, over this 20 or 30-year period. Here we go. Look at those Brits. They really don't like talking to anyone on the continent, do they? It's amazing. So there's been a lot of movement in continental Europe. Again, Austria right on top of Germany, but now the Netherlands is all in Germany as well, and a good chunk of France has moved up closer to Germany. We've got Italy on top of France, and as I say, a lot of interaction amongst inventors and scientists all over continental Europe. Those Brits. They only talk to each other. Okay, I got rid of looser connections, so there are some exchanges. And the two really light greens, they're the two Irish. Nuts. They are called nuts regions. I thought I'd end with this anyway, this slide that shows how you can use pattern data to explore not real geographies, but a whole bunch of different sort of kinds of spatial associations. That's it. I hope you enjoyed the rDNA stuff and some flavor of what you can do with pattern.